Hey, this is Tim. Another little short video for you with my friend here. We'll talk about him today because we're talking about why superheroes. Because superheroes and comics seem to go together, don't they? So for most people, probably the first thing that they think of when you tell them comic books is superheroes, which is kind of crazy because superheroes weren't the first genre in comics. They weren't the second. They weren't even the third. But they do seem to have the longest staying power by far of all these other genres, especially up to the present day. So, why is that? A couple reasons, and of course, I'm going to do a little history because that's what I do. So, you go back, and it's kind of debatable what is actually the first superhero. And certainly, there's proto superheroes like the Phantom, who debuted in 1936, and Popeye, who debuted in 1929. He gets superpowers from spinach. I think it counts partially. But the really important one is Superman. And Superman debuted in 1938. He was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. And his debut was a huge success. The authors were heavily influenced by pulp crime fiction and also pulp science fiction novels. So Superman is part Doc Savage. He's part John Carter of Mars. He's part a whole lot of other things and part circus strongman, right? He's got the shorts. He's got the emblem on his chest. So he's all these different elements that those guys put together into a comic strip. And they had a lot of trouble getting it accepted by publishers, but when they finally did, it was this massive hit. His early adventures saw him fighting evil landlords, abusive husbands, very much social justice issues of the time. And his early experiences, especially the world that he lived in before Jimmy Olsen and giant robots, could easily be seen as a parallel to the Jewish American experience as well as the immigrant experience. So, Superman comes out, massive hit. There's a deluge of imitators because it was pretty easy to just do something similar to Superman. So you had Wonder Man, and you had Captain Marvel, who would later become known as Shazam. And you had some guy called Batman, whose earliest debuts were literally traced from Superman comics by Bob Kane. And eventually, 25 years later, with the debut of the Marvel Universe, Spider-Man and all those other characters you associate, Spider-Man even wearing Superman's colors of red and blue. And so the legacy of this character is massive in comics specifically. Superman has sold more comics than any other superhero over time. So, why did this genre, superhero, with all the things that come with it, that have adapted and been combined over time, why did it survive so long when it's mostly just influenced by one guy, Superman, right? So, I have some theories. This could be backed up by some evidence, but note that this is somewhat editorial. So one, I think it's the audience, right? The earliest comics were very successful with kids. They weren't necessarily all made for kids, but the ones that were very successful and the price point that they were offering and where they sold them made them successful for kids. So though you had crime comics and though you had other stuff aimed more at adults, lots of kids were buying comics, and so they were buying humor comics, funny animal, that kind of stuff as well. And when superhero hits the shelf, boom, it's this perfect genre for kids. You've got them doing things that kids like. You've got them encountering giant robots, monsters. The idea of having power and being able to thrive under the thumb of those controlling parents and be able to do whatever you want, this power fantasy idea, is an important part of what makes superheroes appealing to children and obviously eventually to adults as well. Number two, survival. Superheroes continued on after a lot of other comics were hit hard by various things that were going on in the real world. So, for instance, there were paper shortages in World War II. And so a lot of comics folded so that they could give up their paper to the war efforts. But a really good way to justify your existence to the US government was to turn your comics into war propaganda. This was pretty easy for superheroes to do. You could have Superman and you could have Batman fighting Nazis. Famously, some of these seem kind of incongruous now, where we had Captain Marvel punching out Hitler himself. But it was much harder to do with other genres. You couldn't have Prince Valiant, for instance, off fighting in Japan. So they also survived the moral panic of the 50s with Dr. Frederick Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent, because when the content warnings came out and the industry voluntarily took on the Comics Code to fight further censorship from the government, superhero comics could easily change. They could take out the blood. They could take out the undead, which was verboten. You weren't allowed to put undead characters in your comics, which is why we have Morbius, the living vampire. Uh, and they could get rid of all that objectionable stuff and focus on the other stuff. Have Superman now fight alien robots and other stuff. Whereas that was really hard for horror comics to do at the time, for them to switch to not having blood or having the undead, for instance. So those moral panics hit superheroes in a way, or hit other comics in a way that superheroes were not affected. And then number three, superheroes just work really well within the strengths of comics and also within the limitations of printing, especially in those early days when printing was pretty terrible. So you've got bold primary colors, red, blue, and yellow. They work really well in comics, and you didn't need other colors as much anyway. Secondary colors for villains, purple, green, worked really well. You would easily identify those characters. It's easier to draw superheroes because they don't have those complicated folds. They wear skin-tight outfits, right? So the ease of production can be much more so. Action, dynamics, when figures are practically naked, it's easier to see the dynamic movement of those characters, so they have more power, which, as we described, is important to these things. And then also the ability of comics to deal with the strengths of superheroes, which would be easily contrived universes with shared characters that bounce back and forth into each other's books, and events, right? The monthly release of these books mean you would have things, characters coming together, doing things together, together as things that have a lot of stakes. Marvel completely mastered this stuff in the 80s with Secret Wars. That was a huge thing that most other mediums could not do. Television did not have crossovers. It did not have big events like this at the time. And also the scope, the size of a superhero story were not easy to film. So you think of the stuff that Jack Kirby could draw, the stuff that Steve Ditko could draw in superhero comics was not something that could be easily replicated in live action at the time. And you can look at the Spider-Man TV show from the 70s for evidence of this, right? So if you wanted great big superhero stories, you had to come to comics, and comics were happy to give it to you. So now we come to this day and age, 2023, almost 2024, and film can do most of what superhero comics have traditionally been only able to do. And not only can they do those visuals, they can also do continuity, and they can also do massive crossovers, and they can also do event storytelling. So this makes it so that perhaps going forward in the future, maybe other genres will be more important, right? Right. All right. Thanks for talking. I'll check back in again. Drop me questions if you want. Anything else for me to talk about Yamron in the morning before I start working on scripts.